Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Rose Report. Tonight, I'm joined by Jorge Ventura, who's a Daily Caller field correspondent. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me on.
So, I want to talk to you because a lot of times we see viral videos on Twitter of protests, of the border, of a lot of things that aren't really in studio productions, and we don't really hear about the stories behind capturing those moments. So, to start off, how did you become a field correspondent?
So I did the kind of the typical thing where went to community college, majored in journalism, and did a bunch of community news. The funny thing is, actually, I wanted to be a sports reporter. So I hated politics. I didn't know what a Democrat or Republican was. And after the 2016 election, I kind of got swayed more into politics. I could see that my friends who were Trump supporters on the right had a big distrust for the media, which we all know, right? The Trump people did not like the media. But also my friends on the left, like Bernie Bros, also felt like the media didn't give him a fair shake, and there was this kind of corporate media who kind of had a narrative they had to follow. So I thought, you know what? I never voted before. I never was into politics. Maybe I could be kind of like a voice down the middle, or at least try to hold kind of both parties' feet to the, hold them accountable, feet to hold their feet to the fire. So I jumped into the politics, and last year May is when I got my internship at the Daily Caller, and for those who don't know, so I live in California. This is where I went to community college. So I actually had a flight to DC and lived there for the summer. So before my internship started, in my head, I was thinking, wow, I'm going to be wearing a suit all day. And I'm going to be working on Capitol Hill, and I'm going to be talking to senators. And like, I kind of had that like fantasy DC reporter life in my head. And I landed in DC on May 21st. And as soon as I landed there, I was doing all like the boring intern stuff, like a bunch of trainings, getting people coffee. And then 4 days later is when the Minneapolis Police Department released the George Floyd tapes. And as you guys remember, that night, the riots in Minneapolis were something we've never seen before. They burned down the police station, which was shocking, to see something like that in the United States. And 2 days later, which I didn't know at all, is the riots came to Washington D.C. So kind of a little funny backstory is I had a friend who invited me to a barbecue that night. He was like, "Hey man, I know you're new to DC. You have no friends. Like, come out, meet some people, mingle." So I went to this little barbecue. I'm having drinks, I'm having a good time, and I got a call around a little bit past midnight by my producer, which I thought was a huge mistake because I'm like, wait a minute, I'm an intern. Why is he calling me so late? I pick up the phone and my producer's yelling, like, he's like, "Jorge, the Black Lives Matter protesters are at the White House. They're fighting Secret Service. They just put Trump under a bunker. Like, we need a reporter on the ground now. Can you be there?" So I was like, of course. So I took an Uber. I got there. And as soon as I got there is when I broke the story of Fox News reporter Leland Vittert, who was attacked by the Black Lives Matter protesters. So he was actually attacked. I put the story on Twitter and it went viral. The very next day I had basically almost every mainstream media, Fox, CNN, who wanted to run the story. So essentially what happened is in my first week, I went from intern to frontline reporter really quick. So basically after I broke the story, my producers told me like, "Hey, you're actually probably not gonna have a regular internship. You probably look like you're ready to kind of go out on the field and kind of get after it." And what we didn't know at that time is that the riots were gonna go all summers. So it wasn't just a weekly or just for the month. I mean, they went all summer. And me coming from a community college, looking to prove myself in this DC media world, I was like, you know what? If no one else is gonna do it, I'll do it. And I kind of took that opportunity to be on the front lines. And essentially what happened after the riots is I kind of invented my own position at the Daily Caller. They had me for something else, but after that they told me like, "Hey, you're basically going to be our field correspondent. We want you to tell the stories that you want to tell from the ground." And also after that, after the riots, I couldn't see myself actually doing the Capitol Hill reporter stuff. It didn't seem too fun, and I really enjoyed the kind of field correspondent out doing the dirty work that other reporters didn't want to do, and that's kind of how it all happened.
And during those protests, obviously in the beginning, the media acknowledged them, they reported on them, but there seemed to be this dissipating of actual coverage of them, like what was happening in Portland. So when you were on the ground there, were you seeing a big media presence from other field correspondents or field reporters?
Now, for mainstream media, absolutely not. I mean, one thing that we kind of noticed when covering the riots is like mainstream media would show for 10 minutes. They'd stand behind a building, or even they'll be like 2 or 3 blocks away from the actual action at a safe spot. They'll do a quick little live hit, and then they go to their 5-star hotels and enjoy cocktails all night. So
Yeah.
that's one thing that we noticed being down there. And I think one thing that we prided ourselves at the Daily Caller, or me specifically, is that we wanted to show the good, the bad, and the ugly. So during the day, these demonstrations were largely peaceful. It's people marching, expressing their freedom of right. They have the right to do that. It's usually when it turns to nighttime is when things
Right.
got really hectic and violent. So for us, we got to see everything, but there was definitely a different story from what you saw on mainstream media. I think one of the moments that stand out to me is when a CNN reporter, they sent him to Portland, and
Hmm.
he's at a park. It's like, I'm talking about, it's like daylight. There's nothing going on. He takes a picture of the park, and he kind of tweeted sarcastically, like, "Oh my God, the city is burning." And it was kind of almost a shot at the reporters who were like actually on the ground covering the
Right.
protest. And yeah, so there was a big kind of it was basically two different stories depending on what channels you watch. But even myself as a reporter, even before the Black Lives Matter stuff, I just kind of got my Black Lives Matter information just from the mainstream. So I always thought, these groups just march. There's nothing too crazy about them. It wasn't until like I was on
Right.
the ground when I saw them beating up Leland, who's a Fox News reporter. But it wasn't also Leland. They beat up New York Times, Washington Post reporters. That actually I got to see like a different story on the ground. But no, definitely for sure, it's the mainstream guys just literally showed up for a good live hit and then back to their 5-star hotels for cocktails all night.
And you mentioned these other reporters who were attacked. I remember seeing a lot of independent media harassed, especially when they're recording. Was there anything that surprised you in how the protesters operated as a field correspondent that you didn't think was going to happen?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, I was just kind of shocked all over. When I went to community college, I was kind of used to the old school journalism where like I show up and then I shoot and I talk like
Right.
this and I report like that. So really quick after I saw Leland get attacked, I noticed that if you wanted to cover these events, you actually couldn't even show up as press. So if you showed up, I saw a lot of like local reporters that showed with a huge camera on the shoulder. I mean, that was I knew right out the gate that you couldn't do that anymore. So it kind of you had to go more undercover. I dressed in black bloc a lot, so I looked like I was part of Antifa or things like that. Anytime that you would film these groups, they would automatically surround you, put umbrellas up to your camera, and then they would threaten to assault you. So a lot of these things kind of caught me just by surprise because I just wasn't used to this type of kind of storytelling, reporting. So I knew really quick that we had to really adjust and kind of get a whole new game plan for what we were doing. I used to love to go on like Facebook Live and like kind of talk to my audience. I knew
Mhm.
for sure when these moments were happening, we couldn't do that. So
Right.
it was really just actually kind of adjusting to the moment. And the thing is, these riots, they've never hit the United States like this. So even though I was a new reporter, even reporters who've been, covering, news in the US for over 10 years, even they had to adjust because this was so new. We didn't know
Right.
exactly kind of what was happening and what was brewing in the country. I mean, I had no idea at that time that, these protests were going to go for the whole summer. I mean, it was just so shocking. And like I said, you kind of have to, you were like learning on the fly per se.
And you mentioned sort of going undercover. Do you think that a lot of reporters, whether it was at protests or issues on the border, has there had to have been that sort of adjustment on not being so overtly mainstream media in order to improve your coverage or get coverage of what's happening?
Yeah, exactly. I think one thing that I learned is you kind of want to be more embedded,
Hmm.
um, and like that you'll be able to get the full story. Now, I'm not I'm not sure local media and even the mainstream they care about the full story. It's they kind of already kind of have a narrative, and so they kind of go there to report that and kind of like protect that narrative a little bit. We wanted to show it, our folks everything. So I think the best way to do that is you got to go undercover, you got to go embedded, you got to be kind of dedicated for that. So I can't speak for everyone in the media, but that's one thing that we really try to do because like that we got to really show our audience kind of the glimpse of everything. Like I said, it was the good, the bad, and the ugly, and let the viewer, let them decide. I think too many times in news, they go in with a narrative or they go with this opinion already, and they want to almost tell the viewer what to think. It was
Right.
better, one thing that I learned is that video footage, there's no arguing against it, right? If the evidence is there, the evidence is there. So one thing I learned was I just let the video speak for itself, and it was best just to let the viewer decide on what they thought about a certain situation or what they thought about a certain political group.
And I know in those protests and in other protests that have happened before, and since then, there seemed to be an idea by the media that this was driven by one political group or another. As someone who spent time in that protest circle, was it an organic thing? Did you see? Was there just a lot of anger keeping it going, sustaining it for you as a field correspondent?
I think for the last year riots, I think it was just a lot of ingredients kind of brewing up into this
Mhm.
really bad mix. So obviously you kind of had that anti-Trump movement was always there, even before the pandemic, it was
Mhm.
always there. But then you also had obviously what changed everything was the George Floyd shooting, the
Right.
the, the anger against police. But I think COVID also played a huge role. During those times we were in the midst of pandemic, everything was shut down. People were making they were basically just getting paid off unemployment. I think there was just a lot of anger built up with all that and kind of created this like perfect storm that I don't think we'll ever see in the US again. For those riots to kind of hit at that level for as long as it did, it's hard to see it again. I think kind of a thing that maybe wasn't really talked about was that, I think a lot of the reasons why they got violent in major cities is that since people were getting so much money off in unemployment, they were able to travel wherever they go. So for
I
me,
see.
it was actually pretty common for me to be in Portland, and then I would see kind of the same group or see some of the same individuals in DC. Then I would see them in New York, and then I would see them in Atlanta. So that was actually a pretty common theme where you would kind of see this. I don't know
Right.
exactly what they call it, like travel rioters or travel protesters. I don't know what a name would that be, but I think it was just a kind of a perfect mix of everything that just brewed up together. And to be honest, I don't think we'll ever kind of see riots at that level again in the United States. But I think it's just a lot of things, like I said, played a part. COVID was a huge driver because it just already had a lot of anger kind of built up, and it just kind of unleashed to something drastic that for all of us, definitely in the US, we never seen anything like that. I spoke to people that were alive during the Ronnie King riots. Even though
Mhm.
even those people said, hey, the Ronnie King riots, were they bad? Yeah, but they didn't last all summer and hit major
Right.
cities and kind of had this movement kind of really behind it.
I think that's an interesting point because people still, I think, maybe live in fear of another level of those riots. And unless you have those circumstances, you may not get that level of severity. Just before we move on to a different topic, were you afraid when you were in those protests or in those riots covering them? Because reporters have spoken quite a bit at length recently about the fear they have as reporters. Were you ever in fear for your life or for being attacked?
Yeah, I mean that was always in the back of my mind. I got into certain situations where I could have got assaulted or anything. I think maybe this is a bad trait for me, but one thing for me is I actually get more of an adrenaline rush. So for me, it sounds so bad to say, but I'm actually having a really good time, me personally, because I have an adrenaline rush. And I don't know, maybe that's maybe a lot of kind of like I would say maybe war correspondents or maybe reporters who do the same type of work. I think they probably feel that high too, where you get this adrenaline rush and you're kind of in the moment where your life is at risk, but at the same time, the objective is bigger than ourselves. We're there to tell a bigger story. It's really not about us and like what we're going through. We want to really focus in on, like a lot of black and brown businesses, minority business got burned down under these rights. So we
Mhm.
wanted to focus on that. But I think, like I said, I don't know if this is a bad trait or a good trait for what I do, but like I said, I had an adrenaline rush, and the fear was very minimal. And I'm actually one of the lucky ones that I didn't get assaulted while on the ground. The majority of my colleagues or peers who did this type of work in the riots were assaulted at one point, cameras stolen or damaged
Right,
and things
right.
like that. I'm one of the very fortunate ones that I made it out with none of that happening to me. So I still thank God for that.
We're grateful for that. And I know that you've also done reporting on the border and on the economic impact of COVID. I wanted to ask because a lot of times the media will make it seem like to discuss the border, to go to the border, it's a very closed world. When you went to report on it, did you find people willing to talk to you who were dealing with the influx of migrants or dealing with the crisis on the border?
So one thing that it's difficult. It's difficult to get border patrol to talk to you on the record.
Hmm.
But for us, since I know Spanish, I was actually able to interview a lot of the migrants that were coming over. And,
Hmm.
at the end of the day, these people are actually not, these family units and these migrants that we were interviewing, these aren't bad people. They're just vulnerable and they're in a very bad situation
Right,
back at their home country. And they're essentially being actually taken advantage by the Mexican cartel who's kind of selling them this fake dream.
right.
And one thing that for me, kind of the border experience that that I took away is that, take away the Democrat, take away the Republican arguments from it. We actually have a real humanitarian crisis at the border, and I think that's what I really took away, was just kind of the human aspect. I was meeting 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds, 6 years old that were abandoned all by themselves, or who have traveled to the border all by themselves. I was interviewing migrant women that were sexually assaulted or raped on the way. It was pretty common when you meet a family that the husband wouldn't be with the family because the Mexican cartel will actually kidnap the husband and keep him in Mexico. So we were really trying to amplify those stories. We did get people to speak to us. So even on the Texan side, I even spoke to a pastor that he has like 3 apartments that he rents out, and that his 3 apartments were actually being used as stash houses by the Mexican cartel, and that was a huge impact on him to see that level of human trafficking. One thing is, when you talk to a lot of these Texans, is they don't even care about the political arguments. They just care about the humans. They're saying, hey, we have sexual trafficking and human smuggling going on at record levels. Like, does anyone even care about that? So much of this is focused on the left and the right. I think that's one thing I took away, that this is actually a real humanitarian crisis, and we're the richest country in the world, and there's almost like no urgency to solve that. So that's been my my biggest takeaway. And we're just trying to amplify also the story of the migrants who have been sexually assaulted, abused, and really taken advantage by these Mexican cartels, who right now they only see dollar signs when they look into these people.
And you mentioned the humanitarian crisis, the smuggling, the sex trafficking. As someone in media, is it that mainstream media is not aware this is happening, or do they know and it doesn't fit the narrative? Because I would think that they would want to amplify this, because they tend to be pro-migrant, they tend to be very pro-immigration. They would want to amplify it, but you just don't see the coverage of it.
That's a good question. That's one that I ask myself every day. I remember when the border crisis, when it hit the kind of the news lines. I remember like the first week or two, ABC News had like 5 reporters on the ground. CNN was reporting there. They had Washington Post was there. So at that time, in the beginning, it was like the story was so big that even they couldn't ignore it. And now they don't even talk about it. And the crazy thing is that now they don't even talk about it, but the numbers are even worse than they were in the beginning. I mean, just last month, for the first time in U.S. history, over 200,000 migrants were apprehended. I mean, that number has never been reached before. A number over 200,000. So I don't know if it's not a narrative. I don't know if they, if they're on purposely trying to protect the Biden presidency and like not trying to hammer him on this issue. But I don't see why. I mean, like you said, they should be amplifying these stories. I mean, I saw ABC News. They did a written article, but I haven't seen anything like their anchors talk about. But it was just 2 weeks ago. They put out an article saying a lot of the migrants are actually getting sexually assaulted in these migrant facilities. So it's like, where's the conversation about that? I have no idea. To me, it's the $1 million question. Like I said, in the first 2 weeks, I remember I was watching ABC News. They had like a whole 5-reporter panel on the ground, and they were criticizing Biden. But kind of fast forward, and they're absolutely not covering it at all. It's honestly pretty shocking. But you know what? That's corporate media for you. The corporate media, they have this kind of line that they have to protect. And it's just very odd. I wish I knew the answer. I think, but even with Joe Biden, like for me, it's like I don't understand the political gain of not solving this issue.
Right.
If he solves this issue and actually shows that he's compassionate with migrants, I actually think the voters would appreciate that. But it almost seems like this one issue, they just kind of put it in the back burner. And the news right now has been taken over with Afghanistan. But yeah, I don't get it. I wake up every day just kind of just astonished that it's not getting covered at the way it was in the beginning.
Yes, definitely. If President Biden solved that, he'd be one of the greatest presidents in history, of course. And, you've also covered the economic impact of COVID. You mentioned businesses that were burned down during the riots and how they dealt with that. Has there been, in your view, a lot of coverage of the economic impact of COVID, aside from when we get the job report numbers? Because I haven't seen the influx of documentaries or specials that I thought I would have seen over a year out now from the pandemic.
Yeah, that's a great question. One thing about me, and it started off during the riots, is I always loved to focus on the small business community and just see what they had to go through. So even during the riots, I didn't just cover like the burning building or whatever. I made sure that like the next morning we go talk to business owners and see kind of what's their next steps of building back. And so after the riots, this actually kind of almost happened by accident. Is after the riots, I told my boss if I could come back home, spend some time with my family for Thanksgiving. and he let me. So as soon as I landed back in California is when LA County, I believe LA County was the only county to do this, but LA County put a ban on indoor and outdoor
Yeah.
dining on restaurants. And for those who remember, restaurants at that time, specifically in California, were really hanging on tooth and nail to survive. I mean,
Yeah.
COVID has really hit them. California is one of the most expensive states to even run a small business with all the taxes. And right there, I knew that a lot of small businesses were going to go out of business, unfortunately. So as soon as I hit the ground, I started covering all the restaurants that were going out of businesses. So interviewing the owners, interviewing the servers. And that's one thing that they kind of felt too, is they say, hey, how come when it comes to COVID, you could turn on the news channel and, you had the stats on the right corner
Right.
and, you had all this stuff. It almost felt like you were watching ESPN of news. And they felt like, we get that COVID is serious, but what about us? What about us little guys that, if the governor tells us to shut down the restaurant, we'll shut it down, but there's no helpline to keep
Right.
those restaurants in business. So one thing that I try to really do is give a voice to those communities, really the working and the middle class. One thing I think that I learned in being in DC is that you get stuck in what they call it is the DC bubble in media,
Mhm.
right? So for folks in media in DC, the reason why a lot of these stories never make it, like that are affecting real working class middle Americans, is because in DC, the reporters themselves, they're making over six figures.
Right.
Their friends and everyone they know, it's all good for them, right? They're making more money ever than during the pandemic. So for them, they actually never see the economic kind of effects of COVID because they
Right.
walk down the street, their favorite steakhouse is still open, all
Right.
their friends are still
Right.
rich. And actually, I was kind of stuck in that DC bubble. Now, I'm not making nowhere near that money, so I don't want people to think that I'm one of those guys. But it took me actually leaving DC, landing back to California to kind of remind myself, like, wait a minute, people really can't put food on the table. Like,
Right.
these restaurants are being shut down. So I really wanted to focus in on that and really kind of bring that community up. And we actually were able to film a documentary on it. It's on the Daily Caller. It's called
Yes.
Takeout Only, where we focus in on these restaurants and the servers. I mean, I really feel bad for the servers because a lot of the servers that I met, their significant other, their husband or wife was also a server. So now you actually had two people in one household bringing no money to the table.
Right.
And as I was interviewing these servers, one thing that they were telling me is hey, Jorge, not only are we dealing with this stuff at our job where now we're making no money near, and it's the holidays, we're making no money. We go back home to our kids and they're depressed, they're suicidal because they've been looking at a screen for 7 to 8 hours a day.
Right.
So that even opened up my mind to like, wait a minute, we kind of talk about mental health. And so I kind of went on this huge run where I was just interviewing, anyone that was under 16 years old that was dealing with mental health issues regarding the school closures. We focus on that. And I think there's just a huge disconnect between the mainstream media and just regular working class people because they never see the impacts of it.
Right.
For them, when the schools close, their kids still got to go to
Right.
private school.
Right.
Here in California, when the schools close, Gavin Newsom's son still got to go to a private school. When he told the restaurants, you're on takeout only, he could still drink the most expensive wine in the French Laundry and with all the lobbyists. So there's just that huge disconnect between the politicians. Obviously, this is why our country is at where it's at, but it's also the media. So when I actually came back from DC, it actually made me despise more of that DC reporter. I'm like, I shouldn't be in DC on Capitol Hill. Like, I should be on the ground and talking to these people and amplifying their stories if mainstream media isn't going to do it. But even the local media really didn't do it as
Right.
well. So I feel like there should have been way more stories regarding that, especially the mental health aspect. I mean, I believe in like Clark County, Las Vegas, they had like 7, 8 kids commit suicide to a point where the school said, hey, regardless of COVID, we have to open up because we have basically a suicide epidemic happening right now. So yeah, I think it's just a huge disconnect between the media, those guys, and just regular working class people.
And it's very unfortunate because the bigger that disconnect gets, the less politicians will even pay attention to those issues because so much of politicians' policies and positions are driven by what the media is focusing on. I wanted to ask you, just sort of in closing, there's obviously a danger aspect to being a field correspondent. It's a lot of work, it's a lot of traveling. What do you think can make it worth it for a young field correspondent on the left or the right? What can keep them going or make it seem like it's something that's worth pursuing?
That's actually a good question. So for me, I think a lot of people kind of ask me for advice and stuff, and I think kind of the biggest thing that I tell them, I said, if you're doing this type of work just for like the views and the clicks and the followers and the clout, you're actually not going to last long at all. You have to have a kind of a passion for journalism. It has to be in you. So for me, even though I started off as a sports reporter, my passion for reporting and news was always there. I knew since I was 13 that this is the field, the type of field I wanted to do. So for me, it has to be, you have to be willing to care about the story and the issues at a point where you don't care almost about yourself, that you're willing to do whatever it takes, travel where you have to go.
Right.
I think a lot, when people see the coverage, they only see, the stories, and they think that it's an easy it's a very difficult process to get these stories out, especially
Right.
as a field correspondent, and everything. So I think for me is you could make sure that your heart is in it, that you're passionate, and that you're passionate also about the stories that you want to tell. Find that thing that really interests you and just drive that. I can't speak for everyone, but for me, it was just a big thing is like when I would interview the restaurant owners, kind of what kept me going is after the interviews, these restaurant owners, most of the time were crying because, they're losing their business and they're opening up about this. But after the interviews, they would look me in the eyes and say, "Thank you for giving me a voice when no one else would."
Yeah.
And a moment like that, when you meet people that tell you that, it gives you a boost, and you kind of know that you're doing the right thing. So, like I said, if you're just doing this because you want to go viral, or you want to just kind of get famous off a video or two, then you're doing it for the absolute wrong reasons, because you're just gonna burn out. It's not gonna be meant for
Yeah.
you. You really got to have a heart. You got to have your passion. So find, for any young reporter out there, kind of find the topic that kind of irks you, that kind of like, you could feel it, like that you're angry and you want to go against the system. Find that, go after it. Talk to people in your community. See what, you could even just step out to a Walmart, see what people in your community is bothering them, or what they think about a certain issue, and really go after it. So that's my biggest thing, that if you're doing it for the followers, you're not going to last long. And I think that's just with anything. If you're just doing it
Yeah.
for the views or stuff, you're not going to last long. You really got to have your heart in it and kind of find that one subject that drives you and motivates you, and that should keep you in the fight.
I agree. Burnout is definitely real. And if you're just doing it for views, whether that's anything in conservative media, you are going to burn out. And it's unfortunate, because if you don't, you can keep going and amplify stories. Thank you so much for coming on. Where can people follow you on social media to keep up with your work and your reporting?
So the two best places I would say is Jorge Ventura TV. That is Instagram. You guys get all my full stories on Instagram, daily, and things like that. If you guys want the news like real time as it's happening per second, Twitter is the place, because that's where we would usually break news. So Twitter would be just my last name, which is Ventura, and the word report together. So Ventura Report. And a lot of our documentary stuff will go on Daily Caller's YouTube. Check that out. I'm actually working on an exclusive documentary right now about Mexican cartels in North LA County. That documentary is almost finished, so it should be out by the first half of September. It'd be on Daily Caller YouTube. But yeah, follow me there. I think you guys would like a lot of the action you see.
Perfect. And we'll link all that below. Thank you so much for coming on.
And thank you for having me.